Hello, everyone. This is probably my last one, my review of Andrew Wilson's book on scribal habits, and can't recommend it enough. It's probably along with James Royce's book about scribal habits and the Papri, Juan Hernandez in the Apocalypse, but this one's a very important book on scribal habits. And the reason why it's so important is that a lot of assumptions have been made about readings. So what we're going to do, we're going to go into something transcriptional probabilities. So one of the things you notice with Bruce Metzger's textual commentary, and I'll just add this point, that with Bruce Metzger's textual commentary, he talks about transcriptional probabilities, and he goes into detail about the what scribes all like to do in terms of shorter reading, the more difficult reading, the harder reading, etc. And so when you look at his commentary, now it's interesting that Houghton's book doesn't go into that, doesn't go into assumptions about scribal habits. And I've already sort of touched that before, that Houghton doesn't really refer, in fact, there's only one book he refers to scribal habits in his bibliography, and that's the young kids studying scribal habits. So Bruce Metzger, in his text commentary, he says transcriptional probabilities depend on considerations of the habits of scribes and upon paleological features in the manuscripts. And he starts off, his first one is, in general, the more difficult readings to be preferred, particularly when the sense appears on the surface to be erroneous, but much or more mature consideration provides itself to be correct. Here, more difficult means more difficult for the scribe to be tempted to make an emendation. Now, one of the things you find, and this is my big issue with the critical text, it has canons that introduce errors. It has canon that introduce errors. So, and also this comes about having a low view of scripture. So when you have a low view of scripture, you look at errors and think, well, that probably may be original. So if it's wrong, it must be right. And if it's right, it must be wrong. So so basically, one of the things as well that was said was that scribes, that especially the latter scribes, the Byzantine type text type, was marked by scribes seeking to improve the text, smooth it out, make it less hard, less terse. But let's go into this. Yeah, let's go into this. So it's different. What is transcriptional probability? It's a principle in text criticism that asks which reading is more likely to have given rise to the other reading through the process of copying. This is why scribal behavior is so important, and this is why this book is so important. Rather than asking which reading sounds better, transcriptional probability focuses on scribal behavior. It studies the kinds of mistakes and changes scribes commonly made when copying manuscripts. So put it in a nutshell, so one of the concerning things, which I've been banging my drum about, is that a lot of decisions was made about scribal habits using terms like tend to or might, but it wasn't based on empirical evidence. There's not one study of scribal habits. And one of the things I shared in my previous video was that when James Royce brought out his book, and he was heavily criticized by the scholarly circles, to the point that not one of them referred back to Griesbach's methodology. They created their own, i.e. comparing scribal habits with Nestor's land. But you had all that, but you still came up with the same issue that scribes more likely to be than ad. But all this was based previously, before mainly Royce, I have to say, is that a lot of things were not based on evidence, but saying, well, we prefer the shorter manuscripts, the older manuscripts are shorter, more terse. Therefore, we built our canons from there, but without empirical evidence. So, Metzger, one of the perennial dangers which confront scholars in every discipline is the tendency to be one-sided and to oversimplify the analysis and resolution of quite disparate questions. Transcriptional evidence forms at least three useful services in New Testament textual criticism. First, is useful to helping decide individual textual disputes. Kurt and Barbara Land, and basically in their book, it's probably one of the best books on modern textual criticism, and this is in my opinion. They put 12 basic rules. They wrote criticism of the text must always begin from the evidence of manuscript tradition. This is very important about manuscript tradition, and only afterwards turn to a consideration of the internal criteria. This is rule 3. Now, one of the things, even though that was said, when you look into the practice, this was not actually practice. So, for example, they went with readings that had very few manuscript evidence, some with 1 or 2 manuscript evidence. And also the fact that use the word tradition, manuscript tradition. So when we look at manuscript tradition, it would imply that there's a genealogy, so to speak. So, for example, if you have a reading in a 15th century manuscript, but that reading is also found in a 3rd century papyri, then you see a level of tradition and continuity. But if you have a manuscript which there was no copies made of it, you've got a big problem. Then they said they proceed to rule 4 to state internal criteria, the context of the passage, its style and vocabulary. The theological environment of the author can never be the sole base for a critical decision, especially in opposition to external evidence. But this was never really practiced. If you read Bruce Metzler's text of commentary, this was not practiced. Let's move on. A good example, all right? So we may compare this transcription, this is especially in the era of insurance. The data of general population allows it to make up overall what it might lose on a single person. In this analogy, we're assuming that our rules of transcriptional probability are based on a sufficiently large sample set of readings that are highly likely to be scribal errors, like the data from death certificates that an insurance company uses. So basically, with an insurance company, they work out in terms of car accidents, how many car accidents for men, how many for women. They look at the ages. How are you more likely to have an accident? What age group is more likely? And they look at that, and that's how they develop their theory of probabilities. So let's go on. Let's have a deeper look. So while transcriptional probability cannot tell us for certain what a particular textual variant is the original reading, we can use it to check the general trend of textual choices made throughout a critical text. When we apply the transcriptional conclusions gleaned from the data in this study to a text like NA28, this is around 28, we see that there's something, and I have to give a lot of commendation to Andrew Wilson, we see that there's something amiss. The editors consistently chosen shorter, harsher readings. We may not be certain that the choice of a short, harsh reading at a particular place is wrong. But when the editors continue opt for such readings, despite the fact that these are precisely the sort of errors made by scribes, we cannot be but suspicious of the correctness of the text at many places. So here's the thing. Remember I said before, there was no empirical evidence. If you read Bruce Metzler's text of commentary, there was no reference to studying scribal habits. Houghton, he only had one, even though he quoted Hernandez, he quoted Roy, but he never quoted from their studies in scribal habits, but decisions were made on shorter reading, harsh reading, harder reading, without any empirical evidence. In fact, there's very few studies in scribal habits relating to harder reading and harsher. That's why this book is so important, because it goes into harder reading, the harsher reading. All right. So, decisions being made. So, example of shorter reading. Now, I've used this particular one. This one is a very interesting one. This one was raised particularly by Maurice Robinson. Now, you've got the longer reading, and I've used the King James. Yeah. The variant is wife. Yeah. Everyone that has forsaken houses or brethren or sisters or father or mother or wife. That is the variant. You find that ESV admits that, and modern translators admit that. So let's do a bit further. So basically, the modern texts prefer the shorter reading, the omission of wife. So what you will notice, and you will notice that if you look at a particular verse, it's like, when you go on holiday and you get a padlock, those ones with wrists, you've got the code and you twist it. What modern textual critics do, and this is the breakage of Rule 9, is that they break down a verse into portions. So then, for example, I look at Codex Sinaiticus for the first part, then I look at Codex Vaticanus and then for the second part, then I look at Mystical 33. But the problem is when it all comes together, it's not supported by any manuscript. So look at the first part. A's well supported, the first part, yeah? And everyone that leaves, yeah? So it's well supported. The part B is only supported by one manuscript, which is Codex Vaticanus, right? And then you look at, but if you notice, the first part's not supported by Vaticanus, but it's not supported by Vaticanus. So the verse as a whole, even though it's a shorter reading, it's not supported by any manuscript. So if you look in terms of manuscript tradition, this verse does not exist. As a whole, as a verse as a whole, it does not have any manuscript support, which goes against rule number 9, which the Alan's warned about. This is the point I was saying with Metzger and Alan, they didn't follow their own rules. But this is the shorter reading, which has no manuscript support as a whole. Westcott and Hort, at this point, it's worth comparing the method of Griesbach with that of Westcott and Hort and their different attitudes towards transcriptional probability. J. Harold Greenlee summarized Westcott and Hort's method as follows: study individual readings on the basics of intrinsic probability, evaluate the individual witness, determine the family groups of the witness, return to the individual reading to confirm or revise conclusions. Yeah. So look at the word intrinsic probability. Remember I said, if you look at Westcott and Hort's theories, and even if you look at Bruce Mexer's uh, his major book, um, the transmission and the corruption and the restoration, is that it's looking very dated now. If you look at family groupings, they don't exist anymore. Scribal habits, a lot of scribal, the foundations built upon, they've improved not to be true. So look what he says, yeah. Westcott and Hort hitched their carriage to two thoroughbreds and closely followed the readings of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Now, modern textbooks have not really moved from that. There's not much difference between Westcott and Hort's Greek New Testament and the modern editions, Genesis and 28, 29, 27, 26. There hasn't been much movement in there. And they still hold fast to Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. And I've done a previous video about that, how many essential readings is based on these two manuscripts. The happy circumstances that the 4th century has bequeathed us two manuscripts of which even the less corrupt been of exceptional purity amongst our contemporaries. It's important to note that at this point there's a lot of truth to Green's point that Westcott and Hort established the exceptional purity of their two referred manuscripts, partly on the basis of intrinsic probability. Seeing their genealogical principle could not all by itself decide textual dispute, they had to be forced to fall back at intrinsic probability. Now, here's the thing, is that their genealogical method, which was used to dismiss most of the Byzantine readings, they didn't actually use actual manuscripts to establish that fact. This is the point I was saying. My big bugbear is that a lot up to this point, up to the point of Royce and Cowell, there was no study, so it was based on subjective belief, not based on facts. And I challenge anybody to argue with that point there. So let's move on. Surprisingly then, Westcott and Hort's use of the important principle, knowledge of documents must precede judgment on readings, was more reliant on intrinsic probability. The textual argument was guided by subjective feeling than transcriptional probability. Indeed, Westcott and Hort downplayed the role of transcriptional probability, as can be seen at the end of their introduction. So if you look at Westcott and Hort, they've got the two books. The introduction talks about the methodology. It's very hard reading, it's very difficult, it's very, I personally find it very, very edifying. And then you've got the Greek New Testament, the second part, the Greek New Testament. Griesbach's methodology. His method finally involved the following procedure, as summarized by Lyle or Bristol. If all three of the recensions, now remember, this is looking very dated now because modern scholars have discarded families. So Alexandrian, Western Constantinople, which is the Byzantine, agreed on the reading, then that reading would probably be genuine. If the Alexandrian and Western agreed, then that reading must be genuine, provided it was supported by internal evidence. If the Alexandrian and Constantinople, Byzantine agreed against the Western, it should be seen if this Western reading was one of the usual errors of the Western group. So he sort of worked with the majority view of families, but we know that nowadays, with all our learning, that you don't have families. You know, they look at readings now. So if we compare the two texts, Westcott and Hort is far shorter than Griesbach So Griesbach's Greek New Testament, even though he published his canons, shorter reading, etc., it didn't really. There's not much difference between. In fact, it's closer to the probably Robertson Pierpoint or the Byzantine text than it is to the Westcott Hort. So even though we can only tell how he practiced it, and we notice in terms of the number of verses and the number of words that was in the Wisbach's New Testament was not far off modern day Robertson Pierpoint. So as we can see here, we can see the Griesbach and Robertson Pierpoint and the TR. It's more linked towards that than if we look at Westcott Hort at the third from bottom here. All right? So we can see that difference there. So when we look at Greece, people refer to Griesbach, but in his practice, he didn't dismiss readings as much as Westcott Hort did. Maybe Griesbach's text is too long. This is what Andrew Wilson is saying. He gave too much weight to latter Byzantine readings, as some of his critics allege, or maybe simply treated their scriptural evidence seriously. While others have not, modern scholars will doubtless point out that Griesbach did not have full access to many important manuscripts like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus or the Papyri. It's certain that he would have modified his text in light of the evidence. In fact, let me just throw a quick one in. It's interesting to note that that same argument about Griesbach, but Bengal spoke about family of manuscripts, but he didn't have access to any papyri. He didn't have access to Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, but yet he introduced a view of families, but he didn't have access to Vaticanus. He didn't have access to Sinaiticus. But yet scholars just echoed his view about family types. It's only recently people dismissed about family types, but people went on without the evidence. And this is why men like E.C. Carroll were so important, because they looked at the evidence. Nevertheless, his text remains midway between the shorter text based on the Alexandrian manuscripts and the longer Byzantine text types. Whether Griesbach's text is precisely the right length is not the issue here. The point is that the difference between Griesbach's text and Westcott is largely due to a different estimate of the value of transcriptional probabilities. Griesbach advocated for transcriptional probability as a tool to check out text choices and our document through prefaces. By contrast, Westcott and Hort dismissed transcriptional probabilities as having merely supposed authority. James Royce. The transcriptional evidence suggests that a more recent evaluation of Alexandrian manuscript must include acknowledgement of their regular omissions. Then, as Royce, speaking about Scribal, Leap says, so Royce is saying, look, rather than saying this is the best text, let's just acknowledge the truth that the early manuscripts, the early Egyptian manuscripts, were plagued by regular omissions. So the practice of the United Bible Society editors in these matters has its cumulative effect on the nature of the text printed. Full attention to the likelihood of omissions by leaps would have necessarily moved the UBS text away from the Aleph and B, or the Sinaiticus and Vaticanus base, and towards the Byzantine tradition. Indeed, as we have seen above, the manuscripts of the Byzantine text often support the longer text, from which the Alexandrian text may have arisen by omissions to relief. So let's sum it up now. The early manuscripts, your papyri and your Vaticanus Sinaiticus, is known or marked by the numerous omissions. So if you move away from the base text of Vaticanus Sinaiticus, you end up moving towards the Byzantine text type, more fuller text. Walcott has similarly written about the bias involved in early critical texts. The text of NA 26 UPS3 was a result of 20th century text criticism, which brought an anti-Byzantine bias as a byproduct of Westcott and Hort's great achievement of overcoming the text receptors. The anti-Byzantine bias was enforced by the concomitant overrating of the so-called Alexandrian witness. So in terms of the ECM, this is what he's saying, but they still relied on Vaticanus Sinaiticus. So there was a lot of anti-Byzantine text type, a lot of fighting against that, but it's still carrying on because it's still based on Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. In earlier times, a certain class of commentators on New Testament texts of criticism settled all disputes by an appeal to the best manuscript. Apart from their age, only other argument offered for these manuscripts was their quality, which depended on the circular fallacies described by Mink. Whenever these manuscripts went, these commentators, like Mary's Little Lamb, were sure to go. Transcriptional canons. Textual critics have long argued that all four canons are closely related, but the previous underlying unity of the transcriptional canons was based upon the idea that scribes corrupt the text by adding to it. Now, remember, they said, so the Latin manuscripts, and this is why, if you look at Bruce Mexer's book, which is dropped in a lot of seminaries, is that the Bible was pure, the early manuscripts were pure, and began to become corrupted as time went on. And so, therefore, the more pure text is the one further away from the Byzantine text type. So their mindset was that scribes corrupted the text as time went on, when really the biggest corruptions was in the early 2nd and 3rd centuries. So, which in turn, now look what it says, that the scribes corrupt the text by adding to it, polishing it up, harmonizing to parallels. Evidence here shows that the scribes far more frequently corrupt the text by omitting material. So the corruption was omission, and latter scribes were sort of sitting there trying to correct that text that was corrupt. So the corruption was made in the 2nd, 3rd century, and Kurt and Barbara Lamb mentioned in their book, which in turn resulted in closer, harsher, and more austere texts, as well as this harmonizing by omissions, at least in shorter variation units, and by regularly producing nonsense and occasional hard readings. All this is a result of the fundamental force, the entropy. Things tend to break down, decay. Right? So an example of this is that Mark, Son of God, Mark 1, verse 1, Wasserman and Guri. In their book, explained the use of the CBGM. They argue the mission of the Son of God is found in a small number of manuscripts, show poor genealogical coherence. So they wasn't copied, yeah? They appear to be coincidentally hit upon the same reading rather than being part of their own genealogical ancestry. There is a short omission that could have resulted from homoteloton, especially as a nomonosaccharide. It involved 4 letters. We can also add here that Jesus being the Son of God is one of the main themes of Mark's Gospel, which is true. That's the emphasis, that Jesus Christ being the Son of God. And he's described as the Son of God 6 other times, and climatically in chapter 15, verse 39, by the centurion at his death. It's not intrinsically unlikely that Mark's Gospel commences with the statements of its main point. All the evidence, internal, transcriptional, and external, converges on this reading. Now, here's the interesting thing, is that when you read Houghton's text commentaries, they still give it a C rating. So the rating hasn't changed at all. It still has a C rating. So, the absence of God, we look at Bruce Mexer's textual commentary. The absence of it is Aleph Theta 28C. And maybe due to an oversight in copying, occasioned by the similarity of the endings of the nomonosaccharide. On the other hand, there's always temptation to which copiers often succumb. Now, this is not based on facts, what he's saying, to expand titles, yeah? Now, look what he says. Since the combination of BD, these are the ones which have Son of God, right? BDW, all in support of Son of God, is extremely strong, as the majority of manuscripts as well. It was not thought advisable to omit the words altogether, yet because of the antiquity of the shorter reading and the possibility of scribal expansion, decided to close the words like brackets. And how can that be, really, when you think about it? B, D, and W have it, and the majority of manuscripts. But if you look at in terms of Aleph, in terms of time difference between Aleph and or Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, it's not that hard. So why put it in brackets? So the manuscript support. Now look at this. This is the support for the omission. It's Sinaiticus 4th century, 038 9th century, minuscule 11th century, 13th century, and a lecture in the 12th century. It doesn't make sense, does it? To put it even in brackets and give it a C rating. Point to note, the argument that if scribes commonly omitted text, that omission can create a shorter reading, which often becomes a harsher reading, which in turn appear to be a harder reading. Thus, the traditional preference for harder or shorter readings may sometimes be traced in the consequence of an early scribal omission. So when you get the harder reading, because they all link up, the harder reading, the harsher reading, and the shorter reading impacts on the harsher reading and the harder reading. Conclusion. Examples such as Matthew 19:29 and Mark 1 are presented to illustrate how external, internal, and transcriptional evidence can converge in favor of a longer reading. Discussion of Mark 1 verse 1 particularly highlights the possibility that omissions in Alexandrian witnesses may have arisen accidentally, supporting the retention of Son of God as original. Wilson's review argues that empirical evidence of scribal habits suggested omissions were a dominant form of textual corruption, meaning that transcriptional probability often favors longer readings and should be used as a corrective against excessive reliance on shorter Alexandrian readings in modern critical texts. So I hope you enjoyed that. I think I don't normally do book review so much, right? But this one was so important. I think I had to keep my own personal preference out of it because I really wanted. He made some excellent points in it. I want to sort of raise those points. So I hope you enjoyed it. My next round of videos will be on the Bruce Mex's textual commentary. So I look forward to doing that, and I hope you were blessed. And bless you. God keep you. May cause his face to shine upon you.